Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. May peace be upon those who follow the guidance. Welcome to Make It Plain. I'm your host, Askia Abdulaziz Muhammad Toure. My objective is not to be sarcastic towards any person, any group, or any entity, but my objective is to be in compliance to the rules of fairness and equity. Today's topic is going to be on jihad or jihadists. Many of you have heard this term. Many of you have heard this term in the news. When you hear it in the news, in the mainstream media, it is used in a negative context. But I want to use it in the context in which Islam teaches it, the way Allah uses the term in the Quran, in the context in which you can understand it. So there is a person who was a jihadist. He was a famous American, and he wasn't a jihadist. He was an African American, and his name was Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a jihadist based on the meaning of the word jihad. This term, jihad, literally means to struggle, or it means to strive. It means to exert yourself, but it means to struggle. And this term appears in the Quran in different contexts, which includes various forms of nonviolent struggles. For instance, the struggle to become a better person. So if you go back and look at Martin Luther King Jr. Speeches, he often used the term struggle. And if you take the English word struggle and translate it over to the Arabic term jihad, they both have the same meaning. And this is the reason why Martin Luther King Jr., those people that was involved in the civil rights movement back in the late 50s and early 60s, they all were jihadists because they used it in a nonviolent sense, and they used it to remove the injustice and the oppression. They used it, for spirituality, socially, politically, economically. Martin Luther King Jr., his jihad was focused on a social oppression. He was fighting against social injustice. He was fighting against social oppression. And then towards the end of his life, he was fighting against the economic injustice. So he was a jihadist. This is a good term. It means to strive, it means to struggle. You become a better person. We all in this struggle. Some people have low desires, and you struggling and you striving. You're trying to be something that's going to resist. For instance, if you are an alcoholic or a former alcoholic, your jihad is to not to go back and drink alcohol. That's your jihad. This is the meaning of the word jihad in the Islamic context. Now, there may be a military jihad. You may have to be in military combat. You may be in a situation in a country. For instance, this country, America, they fought against the Nazis, the party of Adolf Hitler. Those people were actually Christians, but the way the trick is that they never mention a religious affiliation. They always mention a political affiliation, so they always use the term Nazi. But they never tell you what their religious affiliation was. The Nazis were Christians. They were not atheists. They were not Muslims. They were not agnostic. They were Christians. So the party was Nazi, no different than in America. You may say the Republican Party, or you may say the Democrat Party, but they were the Nazi Party. And when America and their allies, including the Muslims, in World War II, there was over 800,000 Muslims that fought in World War II, and they fought against the Germans. They fought, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill once said that if it wasn't for the Muslims that fought in World War II, that we probably would not have won World War II. So this was a jihad to fight against Hitler Hitler was supposed to have exterminated 6 million European Jews, and if he had got control, he probably would have exterminated people of African descent, people of color, black people as they say these days, because he was a supremacist. He was part of the Aryan nation. But the point I'm trying to make is that when you strive, there was a military jihad. Martin Luther King Jr., he was on a social and economic jihad. Towards the end of his life, he said that now I struggle. If you go back and look at the speech on March the 28th, 1968, a week before he was assassinated, he said that our struggle is a economic struggle, which means a genuine equality. So you take the word struggle and translate it over jihad, then he's talking about our jihad is an economic jihad, because he wanted economic equality among the people, the poor people in the society, because he was planning on having a poor people's campaign. So Martin Luther King Jr. was a jihadist. It's a good term. It's not a term that you should look in a negative sense, like the way the media try to portray it. They want you to see it in a negative light. And this is what the part of the strategy when African Americans was in this country. When they bought them over as slaves, there was a Presbyterian slave owner. He was a minister. He was an ordained minister. He was a Presbyterian minister, and his name was Charles Colcutt Jones. And this was back in the 1800s, early 1800s. And Charles Colcutt Jones, he was a slave owner, and he wanted the slaves to become Christians, not for their own social welfare, not for their own benefit. He wanted them to become slaves. He wanted them to become Christians because he felt that they would be better slaves. They would be better slaves. They would be more submissive to the slave owner if they became Christians. So Charles Colcutt Jones, he wrote a book called, this is the book, How to Make a Negro a Christian. This is the title of the book. It was written back in the 1800s. How to Make a Negro a Christian. So the strategy was, if you are a Christian today, they use it for their advantage. So no difference today than when they use the term jihad, jihadists in the news of the term jihad, they use it to their advantage to turn you away from Islam. Although you don't even know the meaning of the word jihad. You don't have understanding of the word jihad. And I'm not trying to be sarcastic. I'm just trying to give you a full explanation from the Muslim perspective, because our side of the story has been marginalized. They don't allow you to hear our side of the story. So I just want you to remember, try to understand that the people that became before you, Martin Luther King Jr., Hajj Malik Shabazz, Fannie Lou Hamer, these people, James Marion, these people out there fighting for social equality, Rosa Parks, Claudette Clovens, all these people that made it possible for you to have some type of freedom of speech today. Even if you go back to the Civil War, the American Civil War, there was a jihad. It was a jihad against the Confederate army. If you go back to the Revolutionary War, there was a jihad. It was a military jihad. You have different types of jihads. Martin Luther King Jr. jihad was a nonviolent jihad. He got his teachings from a man named Gandhi. Gandhi was inspired by the Muslims in India who, the two Muslim brothers, they started this rebellion back in the 1800s, and it was called the Indigo Rebellion. And it was primarily a non-violent rebellion, but there was some violence involved in it. But Gandhi was inspired by the Muslims. You wouldn't have the Gandhi if it wasn't for that rebellion. And not only that, but whenever Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi over in India, this is the person that Martin Luther King Jr. took on his philosophy, whenever Mahatma Gandhi, whenever he started an important task, he always recited the first 7 verses of the Quran. Gandhi. This is something that you're not being taught in school. But whenever he started an important task, he always read the first 7 verses of the Muslim Quran. That's what he read, Gandhi. They're not going to teach you that in school. And not only that, his right-hand man was a man named Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Abdul Ghaffar Khan was Gandhi's right-hand man. He was a Muslim, and he established the first nonviolent army in human history. But he was Gandhi's right-hand man. So what happens is that when you live in a society that don't want you to learn things from a Muslim perspective, your education is not complete. So Martin Luther King Jr. was a jihadist. It's a good term if you have the understanding of it. It can be a term that you use to become a better person. You fight against injustice, you fight against oppression, you strive physically, you can strive monetarily, you strive fi sabilillah. Striving fi sabilillah means you strive with your money and your person in the path of God. That's what it means. Because as you live your life on this earth, you are on a road, you're on a path, and eventually you're going to die and go back to your Creator. So as long as you're on this path, as long as you're on this road, you should strive fi sabilillah, because you're going back to Allah at some point. You're not going to live forever. So you strive monetarily, fi sabilillah, and you strive physically, fi sabilillah, to plead your Lord. And you know, before Martin Luther King Jr., when he gave his last speech, in that speech he said, "I'm just trying to do God's will." And the word for that is Muslim. Muslim is an Arabic word, means one who submits to the will of God. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I'm just trying to do God's will." But just remember, he was a jihadist. You are a jihadist. You are benefiting for people who strive and struggle to fight against injustice, to remove injustice, to remove the oppression. You can have a spiritual jihad. You can have a social jihad, economic jihad, but we all are benefiting from it. Do not let the disbelievers, the kuffars, the people like Charles Coker Jones, and I'm going to do maybe something else on Charles Coker Jones. I want you to at least see the picture. I want you to at least see what he looks like. His only objective was for you, if you're an African American, is to become a better slave. That's what he taught. Told the slave masters, let them become Christians so they can become a better slave. So with that, I'm going to end it. If I said anything that was good, it is from Allah. And if I said anything that was bad or offensive or negative, it is from myself or it's from Shaitan. So until then, Assalamu alaikum.